Yo, it's your boy Logos, and today I want to react to Thomas Sowell discussing the rise and fall of the black community within the United States. I'm of the opinion that the family and the state of our communities is a large factor in why we are the way we are. And when I say that, I mean black children reading levels being behind, the amount of single parent households, the amount of black money or black American money that isn't being put back into community. Instead, we rather spend money on jewelry, Jordans, or the flashy things we don't really need or really can't afford. Just to put on a lifestyle or an image that we're somehow much more wealthy or better off than we actually are, which I never understood. My father raised me not to think that way, but I don't understand why other people do. I don't think it's just because you had parents around, even though that does have a big factor on it, because information is so accessible nowadays. You have so much intellectual stuff or just common sense stuff that you can get into that people hundreds of years ago wasn't aware of. Whether it be information from Thomas Sowell or whether it be information you get from your friends, having knowledgeable debates and conversations. One thing I'm grateful of being an American is I can say what I want to say without worry about the government. As long as I don't threaten you or encourage you to hurt anybody, I can say something even if you disagree with it. And that's why I love this country. And I believe black Americans shouldn't try to leave and go back to Africa because we did put our blood, sweat, and tears into this country. Our ancestors did. People from 50 years ago, or even sooner or later, did so too. So what do I look like going somewhere else, giving up here, instead of trying to fix this country? At the end of the day, I'm an American, my father is an American, and he immigrated here. My mother is American, and that goes back generations. And I think we can fix ourselves without needing handouts. But let's get into it.
As of the early 19th century, residential segregation was just one of a number of restrictions placed on free blacks in both the North and the South. However, by the last decade of the 19th century, such residential restrictions had eroded in northern cities to the point where W.E.B. Du Bois could write in the 1890s of a growing liberal spirit toward the Negro in Philadelphia, in which the community was disposed to throw off the trammels, brush away petty hindrances, and to soften the harshness of race prejudice, leading, among other things, to blacks being able to live in white neighborhoods. Nor was Philadelphia unique. There were similar developments in New York, Detroit, Washington, and other northern cities. Census data show a lower rate of urban residential segregation of blacks nationwide in 1890 through 1910 than in later decades of the 20th century, and even as late as the 2010 census. Other restrictions had eroded as well. In Detroit, blacks who had been denied the vote in 1850 were voting in the 1880s, and in the 1890s, blacks were being elected to public office by a predominantly white electorate in Michigan. The black upper class in Detroit at that time had regular social interactions with whites, and their children attended high schools and colleges with whites. In Illinois during the same era, legal restrictions on access to public accommodations for blacks were removed from the law, even though there were not enough black voters at the time to influence public policy, so that this represented changes in white public opinion. In New York City by the 1890s, most blacks did not work as unskilled laborers, but held modest but respectable jobs as barbers, waiters, caterers, and skilled craftsmen. Distinguished historian Oscar Handlin characterized blacks in New York at that time as being better off than the mass of recent white immigrants. The visible improvement in the living standards of blacks was noted in Jacob Riis's 1890 classic, How the Other Half Lives. In Philadelphia, blacks were among the leading caterers in the city, serving a predominantly white clientele. In Chicago, there were also successful black businesses serving a predominantly white clientele, and as late as 1910, more than two-thirds of the city's black residents lived in neighborhoods that were predominantly white. To maintain that residential and other racial restrictions on blacks were simply a matter of the predispositions of the white population, racism, immediately raises the question of why such predispositions should have changed so much during the course of the 19th century, and then changed back again drastically and within a very few years during the early 20th century. But this pattern of progress in race relations in northern urban communities during the 19th century followed by retrogression in the early 20th century, followed again by progress in the latter part of the 20th century, is more readily understood in terms of causes other than pure subjective mood swings in the white population. In short, whether or not attitudes within the white population deserve the characterization of racism, a causal analysis of the major changes that occurred in residential and other restrictions on blacks cannot explain such changes by simply saying racism. Turning from the white population to the black population, we find developments that make the changing residential patterns explicable without resorting to inexplicable changes inside the heads of white people. Beginning at the beginning, African slaves were brought into American society at the bottom and concentrated in the South, a region with its own cultural handicaps that produced marked differences between the white populations of the North and South that many observers noted during the antebellum era. This meant that those blacks who came out of the South to live in northern cities would be very different in many ways from the white populations of those cities. The visible racial differences made blacks easy to identify and restrict. During the course of the 19th century, however, over a period of generations, northern blacks tended to acquire more of the culture of the surrounding white urban population of the North, just as other groups often have when living surrounded by a vastly larger population with a different culture and a higher socioeconomic level. By the end of the 19th century, this cultural assimilation had reached the point where racial barriers eased considerably in the northern cities, where the black populations of these cities were now predominantly native-born residents, rather than migrants from the South. This situation changed drastically, however, and within a relatively few years, with the mass migrations of millions of blacks out of the South, beginning in the early 20th century. This not only greatly multiplied the black populations living in many northern cities, the newcomers were seen by both the pre-existing black populations and the white populations of these cities as creating greatly increased social problems, such as crime, violence, and offensive behavior in general. If these were mere prejudices, perceptions, or stereotypes in the minds of white people, as so many adverse judgments have been automatically characterized, why did the very same views appear among northern-born blacks at the same time?
And you know what's so sad? Nowadays, people, they'll say they're just being uppity or they're acting like Uncle Toms or any other excuse. They don't want to actually have a conversation, maybe look at the interactions, the behaviors, the conversations, or anything like that. They just want to write it off as people being on the side of white people or any other nonsense. It's really sad what's going on, and it still occurs today.
Where hard data are available, these data substantiate the pattern of behavioral differences between the pre-existing northern black populations and the newcomers from the South. In early 20th century Pennsylvania, for example, the rate of violent crimes among blacks from the South was nearly 5 times that among blacks born in Pennsylvania.
Damn.
In Washington, D.C., where the influx from the South occurred decades earlier, the effect of the Southerners' arrival could be seen decades earlier. For example, out-of-wedlock births were just under 10% of all births among blacks in Washington in 1878, but this more than doubled by 1881, following a large influx of Southern blacks, and remained high for years thereafter. The new majorities of Southern blacks in the northern black urban communities were sufficiently large, and their culture sufficiently reinforced by continuing new arrivals from the South, that their rate of assimilation to the cultural norms of the surrounding white society was neither as rapid nor as complete as that of the much smaller numbers of blacks who had preceded them in these cities in the 19th century. Moreover, as late as 1944, Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma pointed out that a majority of blacks living in the North at that time had been born in the South. During the early years of mass migration of blacks out of the South, many northern-born blacks condemned the Southern newcomers and saw in them a danger that the white population would put up new barriers against all blacks, which is in fact what happened. After the massive inflow of Southern blacks into northern cities, in which small black populations had once lived scattered in predominantly white neighborhoods, these now became cities in which blacks were prevented from living in white neighborhoods by methods ranging from legal prohibitions and restrictive covenants to outright violence. All this happened within a very few years of the mass migrations of Southern blacks to northern cities. The massive black ghettos, which became common in the 20th century, were just one aspect of a more general retrogression in race relations, in which various public accommodations once open to blacks were now closed to them, and black children who had once gone to schools with white children in northern cities were now segregated into different schools. The conclusion that this change was a reaction to a mass in-migration of less acculturated blacks from the South is reinforced by the history of cities on the West Coast, where this mass in-migration from the South took place decades later, largely during the Second World War, and was likewise followed by retrogressions in race relations there at this later time. A similar pattern had already unfolded among Jews in the United States in the late 19th century, when the highly acculturated German Jews lost much of the social acceptance which they had already achieved after larger masses of much less acculturated Jews from Eastern Europe arrived, followed by new barriers against Jews in general. To say that this retrogression was caused by antisemitism would likewise be to transform a characterization into a causal explanation, implicitly treating those adversely affected as abstract people whose problems originated solely in other people's minds. Whether among blacks, Jews, or others, leaders within these groups themselves saw behavioral problems among some of their own people as creating backlashes in the larger society around them, from which the entire group suffered. As a result, organized social uplift groups, both secular and religious, arose within the black community, the Jewish community, as well as within other communities, aimed at changing the behavior of members of their own respective groups in order to facilitate the advancement of these groups as a whole. Among Jews, during the era of mass immigration from Eastern Europe, the already acculturated German Jews living in America took the lead in seeking to acculturate the Jewish newcomers from Eastern Europe. A German Jewish publication of that era described the Eastern European Jews as slovenly in dress, loud in manners, and vulgar in discourse. As a leading study of American Jews noted, the Germans found it hard to understand what could better serve their ill-mannered cousins than rapid lessons in civics, English, and the uses of soap. Such problems were not peculiar to Jews, but were common among the Irish immigrants before them and to blacks after them. During the mass migrations of blacks out of the South during the early 20th century, both the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, and the Urban League offered such published advice as, "Don't use vile language in public places. Don't throw garbage in the backyard or alley, or keep dirty front yards. Do not carry on loud conversations in streetcars and public places." Although these efforts produced positive results over the years, whether among blacks, Jews, or others, that whole approach was antithetical to a new social philosophy that emerged in the late 20th century: multiculturalism.
So what I got and I understood out of this is that it wasn't necessarily or completely racism or anything like that for the reason that those policies were introduced, at least in the North. They had relationships or business relationships or interests that was interracial. And that was going on for at least a few decades until people were with different culture and different mindsets and different behaviors that is honestly anti anything progressive or positive for your life influxed in and start to have negative effects on the communities. I'm not saying that segregation or any of the stuff that happened was right. What I am saying is maybe self-analyzation and just increasing your better behavior and increasing your standards is a good thing just for yourself and your community as a whole. Has nothing to do with white people. Excuse me. It has nothing to do with white people. It just has to do with doing behaviors that's positive. Not having multiple children outside of marriage is only a good thing because you're not going to have more debt. You're not going to be struggling, trying to figure out how to pay for things and dealing with multiple different children or even one child. Just getting married first just makes it a whole much better for our community. And I would say not having a father in the home is something that has gone on in our community for decades now. And we suffer from that. The discipline, the guidance, the wisdom. So many black boys could use that in past decades, today, and in the future. Always. For me, in my understanding of history, when you look at just the average, ordinary day people, not just the great people you read about because of battles or achievements, the building blocks of everything is family. Excuse me. Even royal families, the father and the father and the mother, the king and the queen, the prince and the princess. Like there's roles, there's dynamics, and that's the foundation. If you have a strong home with good morals and good teachings and good values, you're gonna pass it on to the next generation. And usually that stuff will benefit everybody. Community, the state, the country. And overall you'll be stronger as a whole. And honestly, if you're more educated, more active physically, mentally as a whole, not have such short attention spans, I would say our country would be a lot better. I would say our community would be a lot better. Whether it be social media and drama and bullshit, whether it be reality TV shows, or whether it be any nonsense involving a celebrity that may distract you from the stuff that's going on in real life, or your community, or the country, or the government, anything at all. There's so much stuff out here that's going on that you really can't keep track of. So it's even harder when you focus on nonsense. Or when you allow nonsense to be the stuff you consider part of our community. I don't understand how all this negative stuff is somehow considered black culture. Gangster rap, trap music, all this type of stuff that says you're not a real nigga unless you sell dope and kill other niggas or other black people just like you. Pretty idiotic if you ask me. Honestly, the KKK don't have to worry about hanging people, lynching people, stopping people from being educated. Because sometimes when you go off to college or you get some knowledge and people disagree, or you talk a different way because you're just more literate, they say you're acting right. You don't have to worry about the KKK holding you back if your own family can hold you back. Your own community can hold you back. It's just ignorant. You don't have to worry about the KKK lynching you up because somebody could just spin the block on you because they think that's made some a real nigga, or you looked at them the wrong way. It's so funny how we just say nigga die every day and we treat black people's lives within our own community like it's nothing. I don't know. Same time we'll march on the street and say Black Lives Matter. Shit really doesn't make sense if you ask me. A lot of this stuff in this world doesn't make sense, but that's what the channel about. Talking about it and trying to make some sense of it. Even if it doesn't make sense when it comes from the mouth. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.